Hi, everyone. Let's begin today with a recap. Specifically, we can begin by looking at Goffman's thesis. So, again, he believes that people can't meet all normative expectations. In other words, we can find ourselves in situations where we don't meet the norm in a negative direction. And as a result of this, we learn how to manage our stigma to avoid any negative emotions. So, as I say in the slide, to avoid feelings of shame, to avoid feeling embarrassed, people will use stigma management techniques when we don't fit the norm in a negative way. So, that's basically his main argument that he puts out there and supports throughout the rest of the book. And his main focus of context is the mixed contact situation. Again, here we have the situation where we have a stigmatized person interacting with normals. The stigmatized person has a negative deviation from normative expectations, and the normals match normative expectations. So, the second section of the book primarily focused on the stigmatized being made up of two different groups. So the two groups of stigmatized people, the discredited and the discreditable. So the main way to separate the discredited from the discreditable is recognizing that the discredited person is going to have a easily seen, easily visible stigma, or their stigma is known by other people. When your stigma is not easily seen, or when your stigma is not known by other people, that makes you discreditable. So, when you're looking at the two different groups, we talked about the two different groups have different goals in mixed contacts. The discredited person tries to minimize the tension, the awkwardness, in the mixed contact situation. And to achieve this goal of minimizing tension, minimizing awkwardness, the discredited person can use humor. They can be direct, or they can use a covering to lessen the visibility of a stigma. The discreditable, their goal in a mixed contact situation is to pass as normal. And to achieve this goal of passing as normal, they can use different information control methods. Methods that we talked about last time, including concealing stigma signs, using disidentifiers, dividing your world, substituting signs, having the help of a partner, distancing, and then disclosure. Now we can focus on how what we read up to this point connects to the main parts of your book report. So, again, when we're looking at the construction of reality, we're looking at, for Goffman, his driving force in his framework. And by that, we're looking at kind of what's the main factor behind the action in the theory. And so, again, the action in the theory that we're looking at is stigma management. And for Goffman, what is driving the stigma management is that people are trying to avoid those negative emotions. So again, as I mentioned before, if you have no shame in your game, you're not going to feel embarrassed, then you're not going to try to manage any perceived negative deviation from the norm. But if you are going to feel a little bit of shame, if you are going to feel embarrassed, those feelings are going to motivate you to perform the stigma management. So that's what we're looking at regarding the driving force behind the action in the framework and Goffman's construction of reality. And then we can look at structure and agency. And so here the question becomes, how is the action, the stigma management, being produced in the theory? And if we say it's being produced by social forces bigger than the individual, then we're looking at social structures producing the action. than if we say the individual is making decisions, acting on a free will. Then we say the action is being caused with agency. So the question again becomes, is stigma management produced by social forces or by individual decision making? And when we look at the culture of situations, the normative expectations that define normality, that defines if we're going to be normal or not, then we're looking at a very key social structure for Goffman. And also, we can look at how normals, as a group of individuals, also represent a social structure for Goffman, because it's the normals that apply to stigma theories in those mixed context situations. And so, because the normals are looking kind of down on you, they may see you as being flawed. Those perceptions cause the stigmatized to use the management techniques. So, if you're among your wise, if you're among your own, they're not going to use the stigma theories, so you're not going to feel embarrassed, feel ashamed around them. Thus, you're not going to use the stigma management. But around the normals, they do apply those stigma theories to you. And so this is what causes you to do the stigma management. So we can turn our attention away from those two illustrations of social structures, culture of a situation, and the normals as a group, to looking at elements of agency. And so here we can look at agency at this point in a couple different ways. As I mentioned before, when people are aware if they're normal or not in a situation, when people are aware of their normative positioning, then this awareness captures agency. We have the ability to kind of think for ourselves, are we normal or are we not? And then also what we saw in the last section of the book that captures agency is how the stigmatized, they can decide what type of stigma management to use. So you don't get to decide if you're normal or not. Culture dictates that. But you can decide how to manage your stigma. Can I use this technique or should I use that technique? That's up to the individual. That's your decision to make. So there we see illustrations of agency. And so when looking at the macro and micro focus, basically, how the framework explains the action. Is it a top-down directional focus, a macro focus, or is it a bottom-up directional focus, a micro focus? And so as I've mentioned before, the rule of thumb basically is when you're focusing on structural forces such as culture, such as groups, then you're taking that top-down macro approach. You start at the top with culture, and then you work your way down to the individual being normal or not. And so the rule of thumb also is when you're focusing on agency, people being aware of the situation, people choosing one stigma management method over another, then you're taking that micro focus, starting at the individual and kind of looking at how the individual is responding to these social structures, such as culture or the group in which they find themselves. If you recall, I concluded our last discussion by highlighting disclosure as an information control method. And I kind of left off saying, why would somebody want to disclose their stigma rather than continue to try to pass as normal? And so let's take that idea and focus on what we can call stigma management psychologies. So looking at the psychologies, the mindsets of the discredited and the discreditable. And so we can say that, both groups of individuals carry a cognitive weight with them when they are performing stigma management. So there's kind of a psychological burden in both groups of individuals when they are trying to practice stigma management. And so when Goffman says, although they both carry this cognitive weight, one group has a heavier psychological burden. One group has a heavier cognitive weight compared to the other. So perhaps our knee-jerk reaction would be that, oh, it's probably the discredited person that has a heavier mind because their information is known or their information is easily seen. But in actuality, Goffman says it's the discreditable person that carries around a heavier cognitive weight when managing their stigma. And this makes sense, I think, once we begin to break it down a little bit. The discreditable is always kind of thinking about, is always kind of questioning him or herself. Am I passing as normal? Do people know? Do they not know? Should I tell people? Can I trust them? Or should I keep it to myself? I can't trust them. So it's kind of always on your mind when you're trying to put on that front, when you're trying to pass as something that perhaps you're not. So that's why Goffman argues that it's actually the discreditable person that carries around that heavier psychological burden. And breaking down the discreditable, we can look at the psychology of passing in a few different ways. So, just before we get into the psychology of passing, I guess I'll say just, one thing about the discredited person and their management psychology. Basically, they can address the situation through humor or directly, and then basically you move past it. You address that elephant in the room. It doesn't bother me, so please don't let it bother you. And then everybody kind of moves forward. You're no longer really thinking about it anymore. The stigma management is done. So the psychological burden is minimized as well. But turning back our attention to the discreditable person, because they are continuing to try to pass as normal, again, it's always going to be kind of on your mind, kind of weighing you down. And we can see how that weight does shift according to a couple different elements. And so the cognitive weight will shift from being kind of heavy or light depending on the place in which you find yourself. So Goffman says there's some places that basically they're safe places. You are among your own, you're among the wise. It could be at a cafe, it could be at a bar, and whatever the situation is, you're not thinking about it. That psychological weight is not very heavy at all. And there's other places that are the opposite. These places are unsafe for you. And so, as an example, maybe you belong to a very conservative church, and there's something about you personally that the conservative individuals would look down on you for. So that place would be an unsafe place where you want to keep your kind of negative deviation according to your fellow churchgoers. You like to keep that difference to yourself. So it's going to be kind of a heavier psychological burden because you have to keep it to yourself. You have to keep it a secret. And there are places in the middle, and Goffman calls these kind of civil places, where you're not really sure if you can trust the people. You're not really sure if you should just keep it to yourself. But as time goes on, you kind of feel it out, and you say, okay, I can tell people about maybe a mental health problem, or I can tell people perhaps about an addiction or something like that. And these kind of in the middle places would be workplaces. You start to learn about your coworkers, and then you kind of learn if you should keep it to yourself or you could let the cat out of the bag. Another example of this in the middle civil place would be school. So perhaps you can learn to trust your fellow students, your teachers, and you can let that information out rather than trying to pass as normal. So there, that psychological weight is going to kind of depend on the situation. It won't be as heavy as the unsafe places, but it won't be as light in the safe places. So the psychological weight will vary according to how much you trust yourself. So here's another element when it comes to passing and that psychological weight. The more you learn how to trust yourself, that you can pass successfully, the lighter that cognitive weight is going to be. So examples you could think of would be somebody who uses marijuana. and perhaps the first time they go out in public, or the first time they go to work or they go to class under the influence, they may be a little bit paranoid. The psychological weight's going to be pretty heavy on their mind. Do people know? Do they not know? Am I passing correctly? But, once you've done it a few times, you start to trust yourself that you can pass successfully. And so you no longer think about it, you're no longer paranoid because you start to recognize that people don't know. And so that psychological weight is going to be a lot lighter when you learn how to trust yourself when you're passing. And finally, Goffman talks about um, you become a good liar often when you're trying to pass as normal. You can really, lie at the drop of a dime if necessary. And so the idea here is the better you are kind of lying and making things up on the go when you're trying to pass as normal, the lighter that psychological burden will be. So, kind of getting back to where I started here, here's maybe a reason why people will disclose their stigma rather than trying to pass as normal. Because often, once you disclose any switch to the discredited category, what you're going to do is kind of lighten that psychological burden. You're going to uh, lighten that cognitive weight that was holding you down more when you were trying to pass as normal, when you're part of the discreditable. As Goffman begins to conclude his theory, he turns his attention back to the macro level directional focus by focusing his attention on social structures such as cultural norms. So basically, he reminds the reader that the culture dictates if the person is normal or not in a given situation. So the person can't decide if they're normal or not. It's the culture that makes that decision for us. But then he goes back down to that micro level by focusing on the awareness that people have to recognize, if they are fitting the norm or not in a situation. And he focuses back down on that micro level when he kind of recaptures the understanding of we have the ability to navigate our negative deviations so we can avoid those negative emotions. So individuals here, when focusing on that micro level, possess the agency to practice stigma management in our own ways. So to continue his conclusion, I think Goffman does something pretty cool. I think it's an interesting way to, kind of wrap up a lot of his uh, ideas that he presented to the reader kind of throughout the book. And then he kind of makes us kind of re-see a lot of things that perhaps we weren't thinking about as we were going through the book. So Goffman, at the end of the book kind of says, so, up until this point, I've talked about these two different groups of people, the normals and the stigmatized. And the way he presented those two groups to the reader, almost like they're in conflict with one another, almost like, they're opposite of one another and they, don't get along. And so what Goffman actually says at the end of the book is that they're not as different and they're not as separated as you actually think, the stigmatized and the normals. So first he says fitting in is rare. So it's actually the deviance that is normal. So all normals basically will be deviant in one situation or another. So all people are stigmatized, thus it's normal to be a deviant. So again, he's kind of saying that, don't think of these two things necessarily as two separate groups, the normal and the stigmatized, because actually they're one. The normal person is normal in one situation, but the normal person can be stigmatized in a different situation. And likewise, the stigmatized may be stigmatized in one situation, but they can be normal in another one. So there, basically, he's trying to say that it is normal to be a deviant. Fitting in is rare, deviance is normal. And he also talks about how often the normal and the deviant can work together as a unit. So again, this is interesting to me because it's the stigmatized people that are trying to maybe avoid this cat being let out of the bag, or they're trying to minimize the tension of the situation. But here he says, often you have normal peoples working in concert with the deviant person to help them manage stigma. So here's what we call kind of the normal deviant unit. It's when you have kind of the stigmatized person and a normal person working together to manage stigma. So here, an example would be if somebody's giving a speech in class and they're very nervous and they're kind of stumbling over their words. Typically, the classmates, the teacher is not going to call them out and say, you're doing horribly, or this isn't very good at all. They're not going to laugh at you. Rather, they're going to try to encourage you to finish up strongly. They'll try to nod their head and look at you, just as kind of a reassurance that things are okay. Just calm down a little bit. So here, what you start to see is that the normal student is trying to help the person who is being potentially stigmatized because of their poor speaking ability. The normal person is trying to actually help them get through that. And the same thing you can see if somebody if you see a kid acting crazy at the grocery store, um, the parent perhaps isn't doing a very good job of parenting, keeping their kid relatively quiet. Um, but rather than kind of staring down the parent and saying that she's doing a bad job or he's doing a bad job of parenting, we kind of ignore it. We hear it, but we pretend like we don't hear it. We can see it, but we don't stare. So again, when we're not staring, when we're not kind of saying something about a situation, we're trying to make the situation less awkward as possible for all parties involved. And we can a similar example if you're at a restaurant and somebody drops a plate and things break. Typically, what happens again, rather than staring or making fun of the person who dropped something, people may try to help them clean up, help them pick up. People won't stare. People won't say anything negative to them, and maybe you'll say something to them, but in a joking manner. I worked in a restaurant too. I've dropped it too. It happens to all of us. And so again, you do those things to kind of help the person out in the situation rather than make them feel worse. So here we have the normal person acting as a unit with the deviant stigmatized person to help them in their stigma management. So again, this is kind of an interesting way to kind of wrap up his book is by saying that, we talk about these two categories when it comes to stigma management, but in actuality, the categories are not opposite from one another. They are the same people, actually, sometimes, and they can work together in situations to perform stigma management. So overall, we can say that Goffman kind of shows the reader that we learn the game of normality, through cultural socialization. We learn what's considered to be normal or not in a given situation, and we actually can play the game of normality in different ways. So again, when we don't fit the norm in a negative way, we can kind of play that deviation in our own way. So connecting the social structure of culture and norms to the individual, kind of acting with free will when they try to manage their stigma, when they try to play the game of normality. So I will conclude this presentation just by touching on the different parts of the book report. So, as I mentioned before, when you think of the summary at the beginning of the paper, just think of it as a brief explanation of the key information in Goffman's book, kind of a general overview of the important parts of the book. Think about it, if you're explaining it to somebody who hasn't read it before, a parent, a friend, and how would you explain it to them to give them kind of the key information? So that's what we're looking at for the summary to begin your paper. A paragraph or two usually is adequate for that. And then, as we've talked about today already at the beginning of this presentation, as well as earlier in the last presentation, the construction of reality part is asking you to look at the driving force behind the action. Then the structured agency is looking at how the action is produced. Is it produced by social structures such as culture, the group in which you find yourself? And then we're looking at agency. Is agency creating the action? Is agency producing the action in the framework? Are we practicing sigma management with our free will through our decision-making abilities with our awareness of situations? So then we're going to be looking at the macro and micro directional focus. So as I mentioned before, the rule of thumb basically is, when you're looking at social structures, you're taking that top-down macro directional focus. But when you're focusing on agency, you're looking at that micro directional focus by focusing on the individual, focusing on individual thoughts and decision making. So, that's basically the rule of thumb, and that's how you can separate the two. There are two different questions being asked. When you look at structure and agency, the question that you're trying to answer is how the action is being produced in the theory. Is it being produced by social structures, or is it being produced through free will agency? And the question that you're trying to answer when you're looking at the macro and micro directional focus is it a top-down macro approach that he's using, or is the directional approach a bottom-up micro approach that he's using? And so then you can move to the comparisons to other theories. As I mentioned before, just make sure that you're unpacking your ideas fully. Don't assume that the reader is going to know what you're talking about. So make sure you explain your ideas fully to make the comparisons, how they're similar or how they're different to Goffman, as clear as possible. And then you move into the part of the paper where I ask you to connect Goffman's theory to life today. So it could be something on a local, perhaps personal level. It could be on a kind of larger level in terms of a national or global level. But just, how can we connect Goffman's ideas to our lives today? And then finally, I ask you to, come up with something that you would add or change to the theory. There's never going to be a perfect theory. There's always something that perhaps we can tweak, we can adjust, we can add something to it to make it better, or maybe take something away, change it to improve the theory. So that's what I'm asking you to do. Basically, kind of think about what you've read, what you've broken down, and what would you perhaps change about it? So what would you perhaps add to it? And again, you would do this perhaps to make it a better theoretical framework. So I'll leave that there for now. Please get in touch with me with any specific questions or concerns, and I'll be more than happy to read through any drafts of papers before you officially turn them in before the due date.